We have two eminent educators and scholars to talk to us this afternoon. Associate Professor Monica Melanchthon and Reverend Dr. Sione Havea. Their topic is multicultural approaches to the biblical text. Monica will explore reading scripture alongside other sacred texts. She is an ordained Lutheran minister from India. She's currently Associate Professor of the Hebrew Bible at Pilgrim Theological College, the University of Divinity. And she has strong commitments to the marginalised, particularly women and Dalits, the untouchable caste in India. Sione will introduce island readings of the Bible. He is a Methodist pastor from Tonga, a Hebrew Bible scholar and research fellow at Trinity Theological College, Auckland, and Charles Sturt University, New South Wales. So he spreads himself around a bit. Where are you at the moment? Are you in Auckland or are you in Australia or?
Melbourne.
Well, good.
Okay.
And he's interested in the intersection of cultures, scriptures and religions. He lives between Australia, New Zealand and Tonga.
I'm sorry to come in, my internet dropped out, but
okay.
I did want to say that they're both very well known international scholars. So they're very well known on the international field. So that's why we're so fortunate to have them here. Yes.
Exactly. And now it's over to you both. How would you, I believe at some point you're going to be showing some PowerPoint slides and we look forward to that. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Dick, and thank you, Coralie. I think this is the second time that I'm addressing this particular group. A few years ago, Coralie invited me and I came and shared some thoughts on reading the Bible as Dalits. So when the invitation came to offer some reflections or insights or introduce a method, that people are using perhaps in these contemporary times, I thought I should try and do something that we don't usually talk about. I have just finished teaching a unit on reading the Bible in contemporary times, reading and interpreting the Bible. And I played around with the idea of what is involved perhaps in reading the Bible alongside other scriptures, so in a multi-faith context. So this is something that I'm just beginning to think about, and there has been work done by others for sure. But for myself, I'm trying to figure out what is involved and what might such a reading result in. So I'm going to speak for about, Coralie said about 20 minutes, so hopefully less than that. And then Sione Havea will follow me and to introduce island readings. For those of you who do not know, we are married to one another. And so we live in Melbourne while he also, attends to his work in Auckland and elsewhere. So we are both talking to you from the land of the Wurundjeri people. We are located in Parkville, and we look forward to this time together. So I'm going to try and share a screen. Can you see this okay?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Okay, I'd like to begin with acknowledging the fact that the Bible, we live in a land or in a world of multiple scriptures, and the Bible is just one among many scriptural traditions. I'm going to ask, do you know what this one is? What might this represent? Can you see my cursor?
Yes, yes.
Yep. Okay. These are the Buddhist scriptures. This one is the Zoroastrian book of faith. This is the Sikh, the Granth Sahib, this belonging to Sikhism. This is, of course, to Confucianism. This is the Quran. And of course, these are the varied Hindu scriptures, the Vedas, the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads. And of course, I have the Tanakh here, which are the Jewish scriptures. Sorry. Mary Boyce, who is a professor at the Union Theological Seminary, has written a piece some time ago now, which was very, very helpful for me. And she begins by asserting the fact that any kind of interaction between persons of different traditions of faith will give us a glimpse of the divine, who could be elusive, but definitely present. Time and space become far more generous when we explore ultimate truths in the presence of other people. And she says, thin places open up. Now, what are thin places? Thin places are encounters that open us up and thereby strengthen bonds. But then she says, in order for the opening of thin places, we need to have what is called thick religiosity. And this is how it is defined. Thick religiosity requires roots that are deeply planted, knowledge of one's sacred texts and the play of interpretations, commitment and transformative character of religion, awareness of the historical and cultural context in which these traditions have originated and developed, sensitivity to the rich canopy of folk traditions, rituals, art, music, and devotions in which religion has been celebrated and communicated, and attentiveness to the contemplative dimensions of life. Thick religiosity is a prerequisite for interreligious learning, which always starts from one's own convictions and traditions. So therefore, sustained interreligious dialogue nurtures and matures this thick religiosity precisely because it requires understanding one's faith more clearly. So basically, the argument is that if you do not know your own scriptures well enough or your own traditions well enough, you cannot enter into dialogue. And therefore, this thick religiosity is a prerequisite for interreligious dialogue. So conversation between religious others with a thick religiosity is the threshold to thin places. So, and if we don't enter, or we are not willing to enter into dialogue with other faiths, then our understanding of our own religious tradition might be or is inadequate. In fact, she calls it egocentric. So, therefore, and some of you might be familiar with the work of Diane Eck, and she has said also that we not only need to understand one another, we need one another to understand ourselves. And so this requires, therefore, listening to the other in order to find one's own identity. This is something that Panikkar also calls, this listening and understanding of one's own religiosity or religion is what Panikkar calls a contemplative attitude, which is something that lies at the heart of dialogue, contributing to this thick religiosity or intrapersonal dialogue. So dialogue forces us, myself and the other, to find the ground of our common search of and in the divine. And such dialogue demands commitment, honesty, openness to learn, qualities which are often difficult to sustain because of our zeal to protect our own, and to maintain the superiority of our religion, which has been the case by many missionaries who have served in our parts of the world. So, differences emerge when we enter into into the realm of another religious tradition, and this can be frightening for a lot of people, and church leaders, church interpreters, etc. Theologians often manipulate this fear and this emotion, leading us to hang on to religious certitudes, confusing them with faith. So comparative, in the past, when people have engaged in interreligious study, they have employed comparative approaches, but oftentimes these approaches have been used in order to fit the other into some sort of theological scheme or overarching nature. In other words, these comparative approaches have been used in order to justify or reinforce the superiority of one's own scriptural tradition. Comparative approaches have also led to very shallow syncretism, that is borrowing religious rituals from other traditions without really learning about their meaning and their context, and the differences are often ignored. So interreligious dialogue involves exploring differences, which is an encounter with the irreducible mystery of otherness. It requires, to some extent, a forgetting of the self in order to offer attention to the other. So thick religiosity requires us to pursue more adequate understanding of our own traditions, at the questioning our conventional understandings, exposing our traditions' defects and injustices, and demystifying power arrangements that exist within our own faith traditions. So interreligious dialogue then invites us to reimagine ways of being in relationship with the other. So it calls for responsible pluralism, which is a passionate, deep, even visceral connection to one's religious traditions, requiring deep immersion into the other, and most of all, a posture of humility. The work of the intellectual or the interpreter can provide a model for reconciliation by situating insider and outsider perspectives in a contrapuntal space or a juxtaposed space that is mutual rather than contested. Now, the method, therefore, is this contrapuntal analysis. And this is a method that has been developed by Edward Said, a post-colonial scholar. And this has been used to interpret colonial texts, considering the perspectives of both the colonizer and the colonized. Now, the word contrapuntally is borrowed from musicology, which means combining of melodies. And Said uses the term to mean combining of readings. The space Said seeks to create provides a meaning of integrating dissenting voices without sacrificing mutual analysis and criticism. So it's the goal of juxtaposing texts is not necessarily assimilation or segregation, but to foster dialogue or to foster conversation between two dissenting voices. So the point is not simply to incorporate outsider texts into current curricula. It is rather an issue of what is called canonical habit or habits of mind that inscribe certain interpretive texts as central and others as marginal. So in contrast to these simple comparative approaches, contrapuntal hermeneutics emphasizes the process of boundary crossing, the process of dialogue itself as another participant in this dialogue. And these hermeneutics allows the process of dialogue to be an explicit participant in the dialogue. And this is the unique potential of contrapuntal analysis. Now, the importance of such an approach to the field of biblical interpretation lies primarily in its very conscious attempt to cross the various boundaries set up between insider and outsider perspectives on biblical texts. And it offers a praxeological interpretive basis from which to approach some of the concerns of both post-colonial but also and liberative perspectives. And it offers an ethical goal, and that is the integration of communities, or the establishment of harmony between communities. So if we were to apply this, I'm going to try now to apply this method and just show you very, very briefly what the results might be. And here's a text from the Quran, which is about light. Please bear with me as I read it. Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth. His light may be compared to a niche that enshrines a lamp. The lamp within a crystal star like brilliance. It is lit from a blessed olive tree, neither eastern nor western. Its very oil would almost shine forth, though no fire touched it. Light upon light, Allah guides to his light whom he will. Here are a couple of quotes from the Hindu scriptures. That is what the knowers of the self know. The sun shines not there, nor the moon and stars. Everything shines only as a result of that shining light. His shining illumines all this world. The splendor in the sun, which bathes the whole world in light, the splendor in the moon and in the fire, know that it is all mine. Thus too I penetrate the earth and so sustain all beings with my strength. I, the very sap of life, cause all healing herbs to grow. The Bhagavad Gita. And this is a reading from the Adi Granth, the Sikh scriptures. The firmament is thy salver, the sun and the moon thy lamps. The galaxy of stars are as pearls scattered. The forests of sandalwood are thine incense. The flowers of the forest lie as offering at thy feet. What wonderful worship with lamps is this, O thou destroyer of fear? Thousands are thine eyes, and yet thou hast no eyes. Thousands thy shapes, and yet thou hast no form. In every heart there is light. That light art thou. By the light that is God himself is every soul illumined. A life that is pleasing to thee, O Lord, is the best arati, the worship with lamps. And then to our scriptures. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples, but the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will appear over you. For it is the God who said, let light shine out of darkness, who has shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. But we have this treasure in clay jars so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. So the theme that unites all these passages emphasizes God as light. God, the divine self, is intimately present in and through the whole creation. And God's presence is unfolded in these verses by analogy to light and fire. The Quran testifies to Allah as the illuminator of the earth and the heavens, a light that guides and illumines. And in the Bhagavad Gita, these concrete images are more than just metaphors, for the texts allude to the fact that God does indeed shine in the sun. God does live in all animate creatures. God does illumine memory, and it is God who blazes in the inner being of the individual. God pervades the earthly and heavenly world, but also transcends them. God sustains all living creatures and in some sense becomes them, but unlike them, never passes away. The Adi Granth witnesses to a God who uses the firmament as the tray upon which the sun and the moon are lamps that perform arati, which is an Indian word for an offering, to the divine. And the text states that there is light in everyone, and that light is the divine who illumines every soul. So this sense of light is more than a brightness or warmth. It is perceived as a living, active, and dynamic radiance that permeates everything, everywhere, always. And this light is understood to be the true source of all things, the foundation on which the material world is built. The boundaries and separation that are long taken for granted by the mind as the fundamental nature of existence suddenly seems illusory, for this light shines through all people and things. It has no edges. The light of one is the light of all. So this light is not merely an airy phenomenon of the visual realm. It is physical, permeating, embracing, profoundly soothing, revitalizing, and healing. Darkness, on the other hand, symbolizes destruction and death. And in most religious mythologies, light is also in conflict with the forces of darkness and evil. And the fact that I'm saying this at the moment is extremely significant because India is celebrating this festival called Dasara, which celebrates the victory of the dark or the evil over against the victory of light and good over evil. So light is also understood to symbolize the illuminating presence of God within and the awakening of the inner consciousness resulting from this. In the illumining consciousness, there is an awakening to the harsh realities of the darkness of oppression, suffering, and injustice in our midst, as with the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. So the movement from darkness to light might be interpreted as a change from bad to good, from mystery to revelation, from ignorance to knowledge. Yet one should not be too comfortable with a negative interpretation of the dark, because there is also value in the night and the dark. Anyway, who defines the dark? The darkness in these texts is metaphor for all that obstructs the flourishing of life and healing. So a juxtaposition of these texts therefore expands our understanding of the symbolism of light. One can see the commonalities, but one can also see how each one of them nuances our understanding of light, and therefore provides appreciation of its meaning and significance. It enables us to affirm God as the source of all light, of truth and love, and declare that God is light and life. So the juxtaposing of texts allows for comparison to provide mutual illumination among religious traditions, while avoiding the problem of assimilating one tradition to another. So the text, when seen as traditions of response, so in other words, all these scriptural resources that we have are traditions of response to the reality and disclosure of the transcendent, we can probe, which can be probed for the truth of the human response to the divine action within that tradition. So all religions are, like the church, in a pilgrim state, mixtures of the good and the bad, of the divine and the human. And in listening to one another and in dialogue, we learn from God's great deeds in each other's traditions, lives, and histories. So in reading the work, if you're familiar with the work of Francis Clooney, he says, in reading the works of our own and another tradition, we begin to enter a conversation with communities inseparable from their holy texts and theological wisdom, and we begin to become, at first unexpectedly, bonded to both communities, even as long-term guests. And Ellen Davies, Old Testament scholar, and Richard Hayes, they say, we may find our own imagination expanded and transformed as they claim us and make us into new people. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. And Nacione, are you going to speak?
Do you want me to go, or are there questions that people might want to raise with Monica before?
We can do it whichever way you both would wish. We can have questions now, particularly if you have would like some clarification on any of the points which Monica has made quite eloquently, I think. Otherwise, we can move on and have a joint Q&A at the end.
Yeah.
Are there any questions that anyone would particularly like to put to Monica at this point? No, I think we move on then.
No, there are at least two questions. There's Ian and Kathy.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, carry on.
Well, Monica, this isn't a question, but I spent 2 years studying interfaith ministry, and I didn't get this wonderful material you just provided. And I was wondering, have these people been writing only in the last 10 years? Because that's the only way I'm going to let my old seminary off the hook. Didn't cover it.
Yes, I think I don't know. I don't know Mary Boyce personally, Kathy, but she has a chapter in a book entitled "Faith and Feminism: Ecumenical Essays," which was published in 2014. So yes, less than 10 years.
So I just haven't been following up like I should. But thank you.
Yeah.
Very, very helpful. And I'm going to read some of the things you've mentioned.
Okay.
Monica,
yes.
Can you hear me? I'm Christine Shepherd and I'm speaking from Newcastle. I chair a very active ecumenical interfaith council, and we've deliberately adopted the receptive ecumenism model also for interfaith dialogue. So we really do work for years and years, have worked on the model of what can we learn from each other. In other words, we have become long-term guests in those various traditional communities. Newcastle being not as large as other areas, we've got a narrower group to work with or be guests of, but more particularly with the Muslim and Hindu and Jewish traditions. So the receptive ecumenism is what can we learn from each other, which is really a summary of what you're saying, Monica.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Okay.
There's Angie Griffith. Sorry, I'll be your assistant, Richard.
Yes, Angie.
Yes. Look, I've sort of been sending my questions directly to Monica through the chat system. Sorry. I figured if she saw them, then she'd be able to address the question there. I'd made just might be easier. I'd made a simple comment that when Monica, you were reading that, I think it was from the Adi Granth, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. I've made a comment that the first thing came to mind was a Canticle of Creation by St. Francis of Assisi. I just saw so many similarities with that, only because it's something that I'm currently working on for a service next week.
Right.
But then my other question, for the sake of others, is to say there are so many points on which we can agree and see reflections and expansion of our own shared points of connection with other faiths. The question, of course, is always how we attend to what are major differences, not just those that might be seen in the thoughts and beliefs and understandings of extremists, of course, which can be found in all faiths. A very broad question.
Yeah. Right. No, I agree. I think the first point that I'd like to make in response to your questions is that very often we are not even aware of the commonalities that exist between religions. Very often we, even I, as growing up in India, I was not introduced to Hinduism or to Islam or to Buddhism in a formal way. there were always these other religions, you know, the non-Christians, and I hate the word pagans, but you know, so they were the other, and that was emphasized and stressed, you know, in varied ways within the church. And so there was no eagerness or to learn about their theology or their understandings of God, or their scriptural traditions. That this doesn't mean that I had no Hindu friends or Muslim friends, but religion was not a matter of for discussion, you know, or exploration. And so therefore we were not made aware of the commonalities that existed within religion. There are differences, as you say, and the differences I think can be overcome with the more time we spend with one another, you know, and learn to understand on the roots or the platforms of these differences. Why do these differences exist? What has contributed to these differences? And to try and understand why they are holding on to those, whatever those differences are. I think, and that the fear of those differences can be overcome only through sustained and mature conversation and dialogue. Yeah.
Let me ask a question. What does this mean for theology? How do you translate these concepts into an active theology that would be useful or could be adopted across a denomination, throughout a denomination, and which could be used by clergy to ensure that their leadership and teaching is makes us conscious of these various approaches and the similarities and dissimilarities between them?
That's a big question, Dick. I'm not sure I have a full or perhaps a satisfying answer. But you know, maybe it is important to introduce into our theological curricula an introduction to other religions. You know, we don't at the moment have that. I'm not sharing this. I don't know whose is it.
No, somebody's turn off the screen share, please.
Yeah. So the thing is, I think as a starting point, you know, for we need to learn about these other faiths, and I don't mean a superficial introduction, but a real in-depth, serious analysis and introduction to these faiths. And it would be extremely powerful to actually hear these religions being presented to us from the practitioners of those faiths. Am I making sense? Yeah. And to learn about, why they believe what they believe, their histories of interpretation, because even within these religious communities, there are factions that are also, engaged in a critical interpretation of those texts as well. So there isn't a monolithic understanding even within a particular religious community, as there isn't within our own. So I think to learn about these other religions and to listen to the representatives from these faiths would be a good starting point to see how we can move forward.
Thank you. Another question for Monica, or shall we now go on to Siani?
Yeah.
It isn't a question, it's a comment. I studied 3 years of studied at Deakin Uni, can you understand me?
Yes, Ingrid.
I studied 3 years of religion at PCNV about 30 years ago. And ever since then, and also because of my membership of the Unity Church, I have called myself an eclectic. I was a Catholic, but now I call myself eclectic.
Okay.
Because we studied the history of religion at Deakin, we studied the history of religion, the psychology of religion, the sociology of religion, the philosophy of religion, and the politics of religion. And because I took 9 years over my BA, I did more to do, particularly in this subject, because I was interested in it.
Okay, thank you, Ingrid. You said I'm not sure I understood all of it. My apologies. You said that you were Catholic, but then you now call yourself eclectic.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, that's a good term to use, I guess. Yeah. Mm. Mm.
And I was a member of the Unity Church for a long time.
Mm. Okay.
Angie Griffin, did you have another point you wanted to make?
Sorry, I was just putting one out to everybody, which is not necessarily interreligious, but it is cross-cultural. You know, I'm part of the Uniting Church. I'm a minister in the Uniting Church, but I live in Victoria, in Southwest Victoria, very much a regional centre country town. And whilst the Uniting Church proclaimed itself as a multicultural church, albeit this is amongst Christian circles, of course, it was about having a greater understanding and a greater expansion and a greater expression of faith in different ways, which I know it's a little bit different, but I think it ties in with what we're talking about here. But I think it's still very much an ongoing work, depending on where you live in Australia and where the country, the country town or the city, and where there is exposure to different cultures.
All right, now could I please ask everybody to turn off screen share? Somebody brought up one of their own files here a few minutes ago and dominated the screen. The only people I want dominating the screen are our visitors and me at this point. So if you do that, now I'll turn screen share back on so Sione, you can.
Okay, shall I go?
You're ready to go.
Okay. Well, I trust you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see it clearly.
Yeah, I'm also speaking to you from Wurundjeri country, recognize and respect to the people and the land and their legends and wisdom. I'm going to introduce this thing that just started recently, so you have a very good excuse not to have been introduced to Islander criticism, because it just kind of started in 2008 in the Society of Biblical Literature. It's how Islanders read. But I want to qualify that there are different islands. I mean, there are big ones and there's small ones. And what I'm introducing today will not apply to all people on islands. There are islands, I mean, Australia claims to be an island, but it's way, way bigger than the islands of the Pacific Islands. There are islands within freshwater lakes. So some of the thoughts that I present is mainly about seawater people and not freshwater. Islands have different cultures and experiences. For example, Japan is an island, but it was a colonizing island, so it's a British island. So the things that I'll be speaking about will not apply to every island, but hopefully, and there are some continents, like people in the coastal folk might have similar appreciation of text as islanders do. There are three things that I will briefly introduce, and these elements influence how we read as islanders. Our context influence the way we think. Our condition, the condition of our context influences the way we think, and our ways, our cultures, our traditions, our customs, those influence the way we read. So, you know, the context of being in Australia will influence the way you read the text, whether you are in a privileged position or in poverty. That condition influences the way you read, and the ways of your people. If you're an indigenous person, you have protocols that influence the way you think. And if you're not indigenous people, you will think differently. Even though you are all islanders, your ways will influence the way you look at the text. I'm gonna talk and use this story to illustrate what I am trying to do. This is a text, and many, I suspect that some of you are familiar with, Numbers 12. It's that story when when Miriam challenged Moses, and then she got excluded. I will come back to this text and identify elements that you see because you read as an islander in this way of reading that I'm going to introduce. Because of time, I'm going to just move on, but I'll keep on coming back to this text so you can catch up with it. So first of all, context. This is the context in which I am referring to islander criticism. And I like this map because it puts my part of the world at the center and not America or Africa or some other part of the world. So the Pacific is the center of the world as far as islander criticism is concerned. And as you can see on this map, our world is dominated by water. So an islander reading is a reading where you look for evidences of water in the text. And when you're oriented to water, how you read or what you perceive in the text will change. So it's an islander reading because of the context, it's water oriented. And just to give you an idea of what that means, this is the island of Tuvalu, Funafuti, the capital island of Tuvalu. I don't know how many of you have been to Tuvalu, but you can see how narrow the island is. It's not wide enough to have a airstrip go from across the island. It has to go almost along the island. So this is the airstrip. And my estimate is about, this is about at best 600 meters from this coast to the other coast. That's how narrow this island is. And because it's surrounded by water, I mean, our whole water is everywhere, then I bring that for the way we read. What are evidences of water in that Numbers 12? And if you remember Numbers 12, it's about the journey in the wilderness, and there was not a lot of water bodies there, but there are evidences of in the text of water being present. And if you're oriented to those evidences of water, then you might begin to see the text differently. I mean, a pillar of cloud. Cloud for Pacific Islanders is always a good sign that when you have cloud, maybe not on the last few days in New South Wales and Victoria because so much rain, but in the islands, it's really nice to have some fresh water, have some rain. And then you go to verse 10, the cloud went away. So this is a very painful thing for islanders. Like you're in the island and you see a cloud coming and you are hoping for water, and then the cloud goes away. So there's a good thing and a bad thing happening in this particular text. There's a different kind of water when it comes out of its mother's womb. When it comes out of a mother's womb, it's not fresh water, but it's a different kind of liquid. It's pain, it's blood, it's nasty form of liquid. And there's another one here. If her father had but spit in her face, so spit is water. So when you have this orientation, you begin to see things that you did not see before when you are so land oriented. Here's another picture of the same island, Funafuti. And if you can see, the island is wide enough for just two lines of homes. Maybe in some places there are three. But if you can see the difference between the coast, this is the open sea side. The waves are breaking, so you can see that this is rough. This other side is the lagoon side. And the lagoon side is calm, relatively calm. So this is in terms of the condition of the water. In these islands, you see rough sea, rough water, and calm water on the same. I mean, you can go on one side, on the lagoon side, and you can hear the waves breaking on the open sea side. So this roughness and calmness are there in your everyday living. So as an islander, and you're reading for the water condition, you look for elements of roughness and calmness, both in the same text. Many of you have heard of the situation of climate change in Tuvalu. This is the king tide in Funafuti on the lagoon side. This is the calm side. Imagine what it would be like on the open sea side. This is the open sea side, and this is in Kiribati, actually. So, and I like, well, I don't like, I mean, this is very revealing because this is one of the it's the maternity ward in Besio in Kiribati. And this is where the children are being born into. This is the context where waves are breaking. I mean, and kids are playing, but at least you see this is the condition. This is the condition of the water in the island of Kiribati. So you go from the maternity ward to the burial ground in Fiji, and you can see places of burial that the sea have taken the island. So this is the coast. If you can see my cursor, the coast used to be here, and then they put the burial grounds there, but now the sea has eaten into it. So it's a way of saying, please don't romanticize the context of the Pacific as, the islands as the paradise, because this is what the water is doing to our people. This is the condition into which our people are born into, as well as the condition in which our people are being buried. So water is a good thing, but water is also very destructive. Another element of islander criticism is how our region is still under occupation. So you have the US occupying Hawaii, up in the Marianas, in Kanaki, what is known as New Caledonia, and French Polynesia. This is Ma'ohinui, where you have Tahiti and so forth, under occupation by France. This is a silent occupation where Cook Islands is still determined by New Zealand. So it's silent because nobody speaks about the Cook Islands being under occupation, because we don't want to, it's the same with the Cook Islands in Niue, because we don't want to make the New Zealanders upset. But as far as, from my perspective as a Pacific Islander, they are under occupation. So what do we notice when we look at the same text with these conditions of the waters, and many of our lands are still under occupation? We begin to see things like the anger of the Lord was kindled against them. So the Lord who was supposed to be leading them in the wilderness, was angry at Miriam and Aaron in this particular case. And the Lord speaks up very angrily. Let her be shut out of the camp for 7 days. So we need to rethink how we respond or react to the Lord in this particular passage. I'm going to move quickly because of time, so I can have some questions or comments. Now, about our ways, we have customs that help us think. Yeah, we have practices that help us think. And this is an image from Kiribati. If those of you who have been to Kiribati, you'd be familiar with this kind of hut or shed, or however you call it. It's on the floor. It's made of bamboos, and the bamboos. What this old man? We went to this old man to get some of his stories. What he's doing is replacing what you call it a string. And then I was quite amazed when I saw that what he did was to take the string and stick it down through the bamboos, and it came up on the other side of that same bamboo, and he tied it up and then stick it down and it came up again, stick it down and came up again. Then I stepped back and saw that actually there's a young man under the floor. So the old man will stick this string down, mangi mangi in Fijian, and this young man will poke it back up. Now, for me as an islander criticism, it's, you see, you need to look for how the generations collaborate and how what you see on the surface happens because of what is under the surface. So an islander criticism that attends to what I call Moana ways will look at the surface as well as the under the surface side. Here's another image. I'll go back to Tuvalu. You have this water. A lot of these homes will have really big pits where you have water, especially when the sea comes in. So you think of this row of houses facing the open sea. Then we have this water, and that small strip of islands, about 12 kilometers, that strip of land that is Funafuti has been dug up. And why are there holes there? Because the pits there, because the soil and the rocks have been dug up, were dug up by the US Army to build the airstrip in that war between the Allied forces and Japan. And it's called the Pacific War. Now, when climate change became an issue, they focus on Tuvalu as a victim of climate change, but not as a victim of the war history that was created by these first world nations. So an islander criticism will look at what happens at the under the house, under the text, and see how some people try to hide it in order just to focus on what's on the surface. So what does that look like? Here, and then I go back to the same text. Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? So there's a contest of authority in this particular text that we need to look for. So islander criticism will, to an extent, will encourage you to see or allow or enable you to see similar things that you see in other readings, but you look at it with different commitments because of islands, because of the water situation, and because of this legacy of colonization that's still in our land. I'll stop there because of time. Thank you, Dick.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much. Now, questions for Sian?
do you interact with Indigenous theologians in Australia much?
Yes, mainly from some people from up north, from the Torres Strait Islands. So there's an elder Maharaja that I do work with. We collaborated on a few projects earlier, but it's the same kind of. We have similar customs. Yes, thank you. But let me also bring in a comment on the chat by Rob Ridley on the relation between darkness and light. These two things we need both of these to, because creation, you need light and you need darkness. What we are trying to do in Islander criticism is to see both, you know, the bad thing and the good side of water and the negative side of water. So we need to see both and not just to emphasize one. Thank you.
I have a question, which isn't Islander criticism really just the same as reading into the text whatever you want to?
Yeah, that's one way of putting it, or seeing in the text what people who are not familiar with islands don't see.
That's right. But I mean, if you're reading it from a different context, you can use the same three words, context and condition and so forth. And hasn't that been the process that people have used over centuries, really, in a way to try to justify wherever they are or whatever they think they're doing?
Yes, yes. So everyone is doing that. Everybody reads from the context. So, but the biblical scholarship has been driven by Europeans who have no, So it's a way of affirming that we all read from our different contexts. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It seems to be that that in a sense that's a little bit like the Jewish way of examining things, the midrash.
The midrash, yes.
And there's layers upon layers of meaning that you can unpeel or unstack.
Yes. So the midrash, I mean, one of the midrash says that every scriptural text have 71 meanings. So it affirms this. There are 70 in the text, and you as reader look for that 71st. So that's the it allows for that. I agree with what you're raising, Dick, but I want to highlight that that's one way of looking from that particular context. Yeah, I mean the midrash is a Jewish orientation, but that particular context there is a Palestinian side to this. Also, that we need. Maybe the Palestinians will provide the 71st interpretation of the text. But thank you for raising that. Yeah.
I have a question. My name is Irene. I'm from the Temple Society Australia. Thank you for that incredibly insightful perspective about, you know, the thinking from the point of view of context, condition and traditional ways. My question is, for example, the members of my community also come from a colonial background, if we're going back, you know, into another century. And sometimes people make interpretations and comments, as you said, from their point of view. And if we don't have this very clear framework that you've just described to us, sometimes we make it from the point of view of cluelessness. Mm-hmm. And then we may offend somebody. Now, how do we handle a situation where we may come across judgmental in our cluelessness? What do we do then?
No, that's a good that's a good point. How do we deal with this? I think for me, and Monica and others might have a different response. For me, the first thing we have to realize is that we are all interpreters. Yeah, we are interpreters. Interpretation is an exercise of making sense of the text. So we are all interpreters. So this exercise is about finding meaning. It's not about finding the truth. Because when it becomes the truth, then some people will have authority. So interpretation is finding meaning. And what makes sense to me as a Tongan or a Pacific Islander, that meaning may not make sense to somebody else. So I should not assume that I have universal, what I have seen in the text will apply to everyone. And that's how biblical scholarship has been. Someone has written a book, and then everybody used that book or a commentary as the authoritative interpretation of the text, and assume that will apply to everyone. So when well, I'll call it a colonial attitude, when that colonial attitude is involved, then we'll get into this fight. I mean, I'll be stepping on other people's toes, and other people will say, no, I have the right word because I work with the Hebrew, I work with the Greek. So if we just need, I guess the short answer is we just need to be humble and realize that we are all doing, this interpretation of bringing our views into the text and taking views from the text to help us out. So, but thanks for that question.
David Miller asked a question about, if I can just find it here.
Yeah. Monica, do you want to respond to that?
Okay,
David, would you like to put your question to both Monica and Ziani?
Yes, okay. I just asked what the panelists think of the suggestion by Professor Mary Boyce that it was the Zoroastrian religion which was the major influence on Judaism and early Christianity, insofar as because of our Eurocentrism, we tend to ignore everything east of the Roman Empire and label it as paganism. I mean, unfortunately, but it's seems to be, to me, Mary Boyce's opinion. She's suggesting that. Monica mentioned Mary Boyce a few times.
Although the spelling of the last name, B-O-Y-S, is how it is in the book that I've read. Not CE. So I don't know if it's the same person, but in any case, when we're talking about post-exilic Israel, and early post-exilic Israel, we are talking of the Persian colonization of Israel,
Yes.
And if you look at the literature which we call the Apocrypha or the intertestamental literature, you will see the influences of the Persian faith or religion, in those writings. And so the binaries, good and evil, light and dark, all of these have come or have are the origin is the what is now called the Zoroastrian faith or the Persian faith at that time. So and they have influenced, yes, Judaism, which was also being formed, and established at that particular period of time.
Thank you.
And maybe if I can add to that, we need, this is where we need to be, our humility need to come in, because Judaism is much, much younger than the Persian civilization in terms of world civilizations. The civilization of that we have inherited as Christians is quite young. I mean, the Hindu civilization, Indus civilization is much older. What is referred to as Babylonian civilization, it's older than the Judeo or Judaism, Jewish Christian civilization. So we need to be I use the word humble. Maybe it's not the right word, but we need to see that. And there are texts. I mean, the Psalms, the Proverbs, wisdom literature, the book of Job, that have borrowed from other civilizations, and those civilizations have texts, and this is the other side that we need to work with. And for me as an islander, that there are written texts and then there are oral texts as well. And these oral Torah, oral and written Torah is part of Judaism. It's that we need to affirm that as well. Thank you. Sorry.
No, I would just like to add to that, and that is, much of what we have in the Hebrew Bible is a result of syncretism. We don't like that word, but Israel being located where it is, influences of surrounding cultures. I mean, Sione mentioned Babylonian. We have to think of Egyptian, Persian, Greek, Roman. I mean, all of these have not Roman, but anyway, all of these have contributed to the articulation of Judaism and its scriptural traditions as well.
Thank you.
John?
Could I ask a question about the emphasis on light? It's obvious that every religious text has descriptions of God in terms of light and life. We know that can be connected to the sun because light and life both come from the sun, the heat and the light. But yet, I've noticed that with ancient history that a lot of the kings like to use sun symbols or winged beings and whatnot, and Roman emperors really went over the fence. All their coins had on the back of them Sol Invictus with their faces on the other side of the coin, as if you couldn't get away from it. They're the ones that were shedding the light and giving the life. So I'm just wondering to what extent, say, perhaps religious people might have used the Romans or the whatever, to in turn, add more to their religions, or did it work the other way? The religions influenced the emperors to assume the role and the powers and the everything else that the sun could do. Just as a general question, I don't know if you've got any thought on that.
I don't have an answer I don't have an answer, but you're right. I mean, people in power, leadership of that time, embraced and clothed themselves in symbolism that represented the divine. So in Egyptian religion, you see a lot of that because of their worship of the sun, and God Ra. So and that is because leadership, they saw themselves as representatives of God on earth. And this was a mechanism to ensure control and power over the communities.
Can I add one element? Now I'm just emphasizing on my islander context. I'm guessing you've heard of Maui and the movie Moana that your children or grandchildren or you yourself may have watched. Our legend is Maui brought light and fire from the underworld. So the origin of light is totally the opposite of the sun, Ra in the Egyptian culture. So this is where we need to see, and this is, I think, for me as a challenge for us good Christian folk. Do we see the legends of the Pacific or of the indigenous people as teachings worth engaging, as sources of wisdom? This is the big challenge. Or we say, oh, it's only this what's been written. That's the authoritative teaching, and not the not the story time, not the song lines of indigenous folk. It's a big challenge.
Other questions? Speak up if you have one. Well, I think that might perhaps get us to the point where we can draw a close to the discussion. And it falls to me then to thank our two distinguished guests this afternoon, Monica and Sione. It's been wonderful to have you with us. You're you'll be welcome back here again anytime. Even if you just want to drop in on these meetings, you'll be very welcome. But the concepts that you put to us today, I think, are going to leave us all with a lot to think about. Getting back to my question to Monica, I do believe that there's a significant body of work that deserves to be done by denominational theologians to ensure that what they learned during their theological training is actually imparted to their congregants and parishioners. So I hope anyone with the opportunity to influence that takes it if it presents. But thank you. It's been wonderful for you to have you with us. Well, thank you for the effort and that you put into this and making your time available. So join with me by showing your appreciation.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Yes.
Thing. Very good. And before we close, let me remind you that the final meeting for the year will be held on Sunday, the 22nd of November. And our guest speaker, presenter for that will be the Reverend Glenn Lockley, who is of Aboriginal heritage. He's a Wiradjuri man from central New South Wales. He's currently the vicar at St Oswald's Anglican Church in Glen Iris. Some of you would know him, and he has presented at our meetings in the past. He's very recently released a new book on being blackfellas young fella, and it will be available through the PCNV bookstore. But I have to say that it's one of the most interesting books that I've read on some aspects of Aboriginal spirituality, and in particular the concept of country and how Aboriginal people don't own the country virtually owns them, and they carry country with them. So even when they're off country, they still have country with them. And there are other concepts that are explained quite straightforwardly and practically. And Glenn also puts to us some significant challenges as the other to understand, particularly the positions from which the Aboriginal folk come from. At the next meeting also, you'll be treated to the annual general meeting of the Progressive Christian Network of Victoria, which we will start at about at the end of the presentation, and you'll have the opportunity to examine the committee's annual report and to elect the committee for the coming year. So please come along and be prepared to, members, be prepared to stay and participate in the meeting and ensure that we have a quorum. And until then, farewell, and thank you all for attending this afternoon. Stay safe.